You ever have one of those moments when your brain just refuses to process what your eyes are seeing? That was me, standing in my driveway, coffee still in hand, staring at a perfectly paved strip of asphalt running straight through my land, right into my neighbor S property. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. No, this wasn't a prank. It was real. My neighbor had actually built a full driveway across my yard and claimed the HOA gave him permission. And that's the part that sent my pulse racing. Not just the invasion, but the arrogance behind it. For years, I'd lived peacefully here. Quiet mornings, birds in the trees, that kind of calm that makes you forget the world moves fast. I'd chosen this place precisely because it wasn't part of the HOA circus. No committees, no approved grass-length debates. Just space and sanity. Then one morning, everything changed. What had been my land, my little sanctuary, was now someone else's shortcut. And here's the thing. When you first realize someone has crossed a line, you don't immediately get angry. You freeze. You ask yourself, is this really happening? You want to believe it's a misunderstanding, but the longer you stare, the more the truth presses in. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision, a choice made without me. That driveway wasn't just asphalt, it was entitlement poured in black tar. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be a neighborly chat over the fence. It was the start of a war I never asked for, but one I couldn't walk away from. Because sometimes, standing up for what's yours isn't about land. It's about dignity. When I first moved into this neighborhood, peace wasn't just a hope. It was a promise. My property sat on the edge of town, a slice of quiet tucked away from the chaos. No HOA, no meetings about mailbox colors or the correct shade of beige for a fence. Just 2 acres of land, a modest house, and enough space to breathe. I remember standing on the porch my first morning there, coffee steaming in my hand, thinking, this is it. This is home. The silence wasn't empty. It was comforting. It felt earned. I'd built a life that was simple, steady, and mine. For years, that calm stayed untouched. My yard wasn't manicured, but it was loved. The grass grew freely, the trees gave shade, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation for how I kept it. The neighbors waved politely. We exchanged nods, the kind that say, I respect your space. It wasn't community in the sitcom sense, no barbecues or block parties, but it was harmony. Everyone had their rhythm, and I was content living in mine. Then, like in every story where peace meets pride, someone had to test it. My neighbor to the east, let's call him Stephen, moved in about a year after me. At first, he seemed fine, the kind of man who shakes your hand too firmly and talks about improving the neighborhood. He mentioned he was on the HOA board. I remember smiling politely, thinking it didn't concern me. My property wasn't under the HOA's control. I had documents that made that crystal clear. Still, something in his tone hinted at a man who enjoyed control more than community. It started with harmless small talk. He'd wave from his lawn, make comments about the weather, ask if I'd considered paving my driveway. Then the conversation shifted. He began dropping hints, lightly at first, about how my yard looked a little wild. I'd laugh it off, explaining that I preferred a natural look. He'd chuckle, but his eyes would linger. The kind of look that says, you're not meeting the standard. And when people like Stephen say standard, what they really mean is their comfort zone. That's the thing about control. It rarely announces itself. It comes disguised as advice, wrapped in friendliness. You know, he'd say one afternoon, the HOA really helps maintain property values. You'd fit right in if you joined. I'd remind him, calmly, that I wasn't part of the HOA. He'd nod, but there was a flicker of something behind his smile. Maybe disbelief, maybe annoyance. Some people can stand the idea of someone living by their own rules. It challenges their sense of order. And I get it, to a degree. For people like Stephen, rules give life structure. They're a comfort blanket woven from control. But for me, freedom is structure. My home wasn't just a piece of land. It was a statement that I didn't need permission to live the way I wanted. That difference in mindset might seem small, but it's exactly where the cracks began forming. As months passed, his comments grew bolder. He'd critique how I trimmed my hedges or joke about how our side of the street could use a little HOA polish. Each remark was like a tiny seed planted in suspicion. Still, I chose patience. I've always believed you can tell a lot about a person by how they handle boundaries, literal and emotional ones. Stephen didn't just test mine, he ignored them completely. Looking back, maybe I should have seen it coming. Every story like this starts with a warning we choose to ignore. I told myself it was harmless. Neighbors make comments all the time. But deep down, there was a whisper, a quiet tension in the air every time he mentioned the HOA. It wasn't conversation anymore. It was a subtle claim of ownership over what wasn't his. The irony is, he probably saw me as stubborn, maybe even uncooperative. But what he didn't understand was that independence isn't defiance. It's dignity. I wasn't rejecting the HOA out of rebellion. I just believed in personal responsibility. My home, my choices, my peace. And peace, as I was about to learn, is fragile. It doesn't vanish in one big moment. It erodes quietly through a series of small, overlooked ones. And that's exactly how it happened. One polite smile, one helpful suggestion, one thinly veiled criticism at a time. Until one morning, my quiet life met the full force of Stephen's version of improvement. And that's when my real education in boundaries and justice began. The first thing I noticed wasn't the driveway itself. It was the silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I'd been gone for 3 weeks on a consulting trip, excited to get home, to that familiar crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the sight of my little patch of peace. But when I turned the corner, that comfort evaporated. There, cutting across the edge of my property, was something dark, smooth, and gleaming under the sun. A brand new strip of asphalt. It looked out of place, too perfect, too deliberate. For a few seconds, my brain refused to catch up with what my eyes were telling me. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there, trying to make sense of the impossible. The air smelled like oil and tar, that heavy chemical scent that clings to your skin. The asphalt was still soft, faintly warm beneath my boots. My mind started racing. Where my oak trees once stood, trees I'd planted myself, was now a flat, lifeless stretch of blacktop. 6 trees, gone without a trace. The ground where wildflowers used to bloom had been bulldozed into obedience. My wooded area was now a neatly paved path leading straight to my neighbor's garage. I remember touching the edge of it, feeling the sharp contrast between rough earth and cold pavement, and realizing someone had done this deliberately. Not accidentally, not mistakenly, deliberately. You know that strange moment when anger hasn't quite caught up yet, but disbelief already has? I felt that. My hands were trembling, not from rage, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. How could anyone think they had the right to build on land that wasn't theirs? The sheer arrogance of it made my stomach twist. I looked over toward my neighbor's house, and there he was, Stephen. watering his lawn like nothing was wrong. That same smug posture, that self-satisfied calm. The sight of him there, so casual, made my pulse spike. I walked straight across the yard, heart pounding, and knocked on his door. He opened it with that forced politeness that barely hides contempt. I didn't waste time. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, pointing toward the driveway. His response was a smirk. "The HOA approved it," he said flatly, as if that explained everything. "It's all legal." For a moment, I thought he was joking. Maybe he didn't understand where his property line ended. Maybe there had been a mistake. But the way he looked at me, calm, confident, almost entertained, told me he knew exactly what he'd done. I said, "Stephen, I'm not part of the HOA. You know that." He shrugged. "Well, the board decided this route improves neighborhood access and safety. We did a survey. Everything checks out." I stared at him, trying to process the absurdity. He was standing there, on my property, telling me that some committee, an organization I didn't even belong to, had the authority to decide how my land should be used. And the casual tone he used, it was the kind that said, "You should be thanking me." That's when disbelief gave way to something deeper. Violation. There's something sacred about property, not in a material sense, but in the meaning behind it. It's about control, privacy, the right to decide what happens on your land. It's not about money. It's about identity. And in that moment, I felt stripped of it. Every inch of soil under that asphalt was mine. I'd paid for it, cared for it, walked it every morning. And now it was claimed, paved over, and justified by a neighbor's sense of entitlement. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I said, "You're going to have to remove it." His smirk didn't fade. "You're being unreasonable," he replied. "This benefits everyone. Maybe if you joined the HOA like a responsible homeowner, you'd understand." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the insult, but because of the arrogance. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no hint of remorse. He believed he was right. And that belief, that complete moral blindness, was more dangerous than the driveway itself. People like that don't stop when you ask them to. They stop when they re-forced to. I remember walking back across my yard, the sun dipping low behind me, every step heavier than the last. My property suddenly felt smaller, invaded, as though the boundaries had dissolved overnight. The driveway cut through more than land. It cut through my sense of safety. The quiet I'd loved about this place was now filled with something else. Tension. That feeling that someone could just decide, without consequence, to take what was yours. But beneath that fear, something else started to build. A sense of clarity. There comes a point in every conflict where emotion gives way to purpose. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was resolved. People like Stephen count on silence. They thrive on the assumption that you'll just accept it, that you'll avoid conflict because it's not worth the trouble. But I knew deep down that if I let this go, it wouldn't stop with the driveway. It never does. Entitlement doesn't end at one act. It grows, it spreads, it consumes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, his smirk, the cold certainty in his tone. Somewhere between frustration and exhaustion, I made a promise to myself. I would not let this stand. The next morning, I pulled out my old property survey from when I bought the house, traced the lines with my finger, and felt that quiet fire in my chest solidify. There's a fine line between patience and passivity, and I realized I'd crossed it long ago. When someone steals your peace, you have two options. You can try to reason with them, Or you can remind them that peace has boundaries. That driveway wasn't just on my land anymore. It was on borrowed time. The morning after I confronted Stephen, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my coffee as it went cold. I'd spent the entire night thinking about that conversation, about his smirk, about how easily he dismissed my rights like they were an inconvenience. It wasn't just the driveway anymore, it was the principle. So I decided to get answers, real answers, the kind you can't argue with. I called a local surveying company, explained the situation, and asked if they could perform a rush job. I remember the voice on the other end, steady, professional, not surprised. "You'd be amazed how often we get calls like this," he said. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't rare. It was entitlement disguised as misunderstanding. When the surveyor arrived a few days later, he didn't say much, just nodded, set up his tripod, and started working. Watching him measure and mark the land was strangely grounding. It was proof in motion, facts being drawn out of dirt and boundary lines. When he finished, he walked over with a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "You were right," he said. "The driveway crosses into your property, about 40 feet at the deepest point." I felt that mix of relief and fury rise in my chest. Relief because I wasn't crazy. Fury because now it was official. Someone had knowingly stolen part of my land. I printed copies of the survey, took photos, and documented everything. The trees that had been cut down, the cleared soil, even the tire tracks from the construction crew. Evidence, proof, truth that didn't care about anyone's opinion. With that folder under my arm, I walked straight back to Stephen's house, thinking maybe, just maybe, confronted with facts, he'd admit his mistake. I knocked on the door, heart steady, voice calm. When he opened it, I handed him the papers. "Here's the new survey," I said. "It confirms the driveway's on my property. You need to remove it." He barely glanced at the documents before chuckling. "That can't be right," he said. "We had our own survey done. The HOA handled it." He disappeared inside for a moment and returned with his own paperwork. Neat, official-looking, stamped with a company name I didn't recognize. "See? Precision Property Solutions confirmed it's on HOA land." I remember staring at that page, the logo, the crisp lines, and feeling that same strange silence again. The kind right before anger takes shape. Because something about it didn't add up. The date, the format, even the phrasing. It looked more like a printout than a professional document. "Who hired them?" I asked. "The HOA," he said confidently. "They did everything by the book." That's when it hit me. This wasn't ignorance. It was calculated. He'd gone through the motions to look legitimate, while knowing exactly what he was doing. "Stephen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you're using a fake survey to justify trespassing." He smirked again, that same infuriating smirk, and said, "You can believe whatever you want. The HOA stands by it." Then he shut the door. Just like that. No discussion, no apology. Just the sound of the door locking, as if that ended the conversation. I went home shaking, partly from anger, partly from disbelief. How could anyone be that brazen? But here's what I've learned about people like Stephen. They were not driven by logic. They're driven by control. When you threaten that control, they double down. They lie, they manipulate, and they convince themselves they're right. That's when I knew this wasn't something I could solve by knocking on a door. I needed someone who understood the system better than he did. Someone who spoke the language of law, not emotion. I reached out to a property attorney recommended by a friend. When we met, I laid everything out, the original survey, the new one, the photos, Stephen's official document. The attorney listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally, eyes scanning each page. When he finished, he leaned back and said, "This isn't just trespassing. This is fraud." He tapped the fake survey with his pen. And whoever produced this might have just committed a serious crime. Hearing those words gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks: validation. This wasn't a petty neighbor dispute. This was something bigger, something that required accountability. He explained my options with the calm confidence of someone who'd seen too many similar cases. "You've got a textbook property encroachment here," he said. "But the fake survey? That changes everything. We're talking possible criminal mischief, destruction of property, even conspiracy if others were involved." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that carries quiet certainty. "You have an open and shut case." I left his office feeling a strange mix of power and exhaustion. Power, because I finally had someone on my side who understood how to fight this. Exhaustion, because it confirmed just how far Stephen had gone. It's one thing to make a mistake. It's another to create a lie and hide behind it. The attorney drafted a certified letter to Stephen and the HOA, demanding immediate removal of the driveway and compensation for damages. He even suggested we include the cost of the survey and the trees that were cut down. "Let's see how confident they are when this becomes official," he said. Days later, a response came from the HOA's attorney. Arrogant, defensive, full of legal posturing. They claimed their survey was accurate and mine was wrong. But when my attorney read it, he laughed. Not a mocking laugh, more of a knowing one. "I've seen this before," he said. "That company name, Precision Property Solutions? They're not licensed surveyors." He pulled up a state database right in front of me. Nothing. No license, no record. Just a name that sounded official enough to fool people who didn't check. "Who owns it?" I asked. He smirked. "Stephen's brother-in-law." That revelation landed like thunder. All the pieces snapped into place. The confidence, the fake survey, the smug dismissal. It wasn't the HOA approving anything. It was Stephen manipulating everyone around him, using fake authority to justify his invasion. My attorney leaned forward and said, "We're filing a lawsuit. Fraud, trespassing, property damage, the works." And in that moment, I realized something important. People like Stephen think they can bend truth to fit their ego. They rely on others staying quiet, intimidated, too tired to fight. But truth has its own patience. It waits. It builds. And when it finally comes forward, it doesn't just reveal the lie. It exposes the person who built it. That when I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like someone reclaiming what was rightfully his. Some things snap quietly. Others break loud enough for the whole world to hear. By the time the court had issued its preliminary order telling Stephen to stop using the illegal driveway, I thought maybe, just maybe, reason would take hold. But entitlement doesn't listen to reason. Every day, I'd watch from my porch as he rolled his truck down that strip of asphalt, crossing my property like it was his birthright. It wasn't ignorance anymore. It was defiance. The kind of defiance that feeds on arrogance and the illusion of control. That was the moment something in me shifted. I wasn't angry in the shouting sense anymore. I was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes right before decisive action. I called my attorney first. "You've got every right to block access," he said. "Just make sure it's on your side of the line." That sentence was all the permission I needed. Sometimes justice doesn't roar in courtrooms. It hums quietly through a well-executed plan. I wanted to end this the same way he started it. Boldly, unmistakably, and within my rights. So I began making calls. A fencing company, a heavy equipment rental service, and a supplier who specialized in concrete barriers, the kind used on highways. The idea wasn't just to stop him, it was to send a message that couldn't be ignored. When Saturday morning arrived, the sun was sharp and clear, as if it wanted to witness what was about to unfold. The flatbed truck arrived first, carrying 6 massive concrete blocks, each one gray, heavy, and final. They sat on my lawn like monuments to patience that had finally run out. Then came the excavator, rumbling down the street like justice on treads. The operator, a big man with a calm demeanor, climbed down and said, "You sure about this?" I nodded. Absolutely. As we unloaded the barriers, neighbors started to gather. People love a spectacle, especially one involving the HOA's golden boy getting humbled. Some watched quietly from porches, others whispered, phones out, recording every movement. I didn't mind. Let them see. Let them understand what happens when arrogance meets consequence. And right on cue, Stephen stepped out of his house, wearing that same look of disbelief mixed with superiority. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted across the yard. I met his gaze, steady and calm. "Making property improvements," I said. He marched closer, voice rising. "You can't block the driveway. That's illegal." His words echoed off the pavement, full of manufactured outrage. I smiled. Not cruelly, just knowingly. "You're right," I said. "It would be, if this were your driveway." I handed him a copy of the court order, just in case he'd forgotten. He stared at it, his jaw tightening as the excavator's engine roared back to life. The sound of steel meeting earth is one of the most satisfying noises I've ever heard. The operator positioned the first barrier perfectly across the blacktop, lowering it with precision until it thudded into place. Then another, and another, forming a solid wall of gray that cut the illegal path cleanly in half. Stephen's face turned red, his hands shaking as he pointed and yelled to no one in particular. But words mean nothing against concrete. The barriers didn't argue. They just stood there, immovable and absolute. When the last one was set, I asked the operator to dig a trench behind them, 3 feet deep, wide enough to make sure even the most determined fool couldn't cross. The excavator carved into the earth, tossing dirt into a growing mound on my side of the property. Each scoop felt symbolic, like burying the last remnants of tolerance. By the time he finished, the trench looked like a moat. Between the concrete wall and that pit of earth, the message was clear. The invasion ends here. Stephen stood at the edge of the line, staring, phone in hand, probably calling the HOA attorney or anyone who'd still listen. The irony was almost poetic. The man who believed rules were weapons suddenly found himself powerless before one simple truth. The law doesn't bend to ego. I could see him gesturing wildly, pacing, trying to assert control in a situation that had already slipped from his hands. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. There's a certain quiet power in reclaiming what's yours without lowering yourself to the same level of pettiness that started the fight. As the excavator rumbled away, I set up 2 trail cameras aimed directly at the barriers, installed "private property, no trespassing" signs, and dusted my hands off. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift off my chest. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was balance. That afternoon, I watched from my porch as Stephen paced along the barriers, measuring them, muttering under his breath. At one point, he tried to take pictures, probably hoping to twist the story later. But deep down, I think he knew. Every inch of that wall screamed a truth he couldn't rewrite. His power had boundaries now, visible, immovable ones, Neighbors started to talk, of course. Some laughed quietly, others nodded with approval. One older man across the street raised his coffee mug toward me in silent salute. Word spread fast. The HOA board was in a panic. Emails flying. Emergency meetings scheduled. But panic doesn't undo the past. It doesn't remove concrete. And it doesn't erase arrogance. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the barrier, I sat outside and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the satisfaction of standing up for yourself without apology. Because sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't destruction. It's clarity. It's drawing a line so bold that no one ever dares to cross it again. When the police detective called, I felt my pulse skip. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. After months of tension, silence, and smirks from across the property line, it finally felt like something was shifting. He asked if I could come in to clarify a few things about the survey situation. The tone said it all. This wasn't a casual chat. This was the beginning of accountability. I gathered my binder, the photos, the surveys, the letter from the attorney, everything, and met him the next morning. The detective listened quietly as I walked him through each detail. How the driveway appeared, how Stephen insisted the HOA approved it, and how the so-called survey came from a company that didn't exist in any legitimate registry. When I handed him the documents, he nodded, flipped through a few pages, and said, "We've been looking into this. You did the right thing." That single sentence carried more relief than I expected. A few weeks later, word spread through the neighborhood before it even reached me officially. Stephen had been arrested. Fraud, property damage, and something the detective called criminal mischief. His brother-in-law, the one behind the fake survey company, had been taken in too. I should have felt triumphant, but the first emotion I felt was something closer to disbelief. After all the arrogance, the threats, the smug looks from his porch, he was finally facing something bigger than his ego. The law. When I saw the police cars outside his house, part of me wanted to look away. There's something sobering about seeing justice play out in real time. But another part of me, call it the part that had endured the sleepless nights, the anxiety of being violated in my own home, needed to see it. Needed to witness the moment arrogance met consequence. The sight of him being led down his own driveway, the one he built across my land, felt poetic in a way no story could script. The HOA went silent. No more letters, no more condescending emails. They released a statement later that week, distancing themselves from Stephen, calling his actions unauthorized and unfortunate. I remember reading it and laughing under my breath. The same board that had threatened me with lawsuits now wanted to pretend they'd been innocent bystanders. But that's how people react when truth arrives. It forces them to pick a side. And no one wanted to stand next to a sinking ship. As the weeks passed, the story grew legs. Local news picked it up. HOA member arrested for fraud after building driveway on neighbor AS property. The headline alone was enough to spark outrage. Reporters camped out for photos. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes. And suddenly, the man who once represented neighborhood standards became the embodiment of everything wrong with power gone unchecked. People I barely knew started stopping by, quietly thanking me for standing up, for not letting him get away with it. It was strange being seen as some kind of local hero, when all I'd wanted was peace. But maybe that's what real justice looks like. It doesn't just restore balance for one person. It reminds everyone else that boundaries matter. When the trial began, I sat in the courtroom a few rows behind my attorney, surrounded by the quiet hum of curiosity and tension. Stephen looked smaller somehow. The man who once stood tall with certainty now avoided eye contact. His shoulders curved inward, his confidence eroded by reality. His brother-in-law sat beside him, pale and tight-lipped. The prosecutor opened by outlining the chain of lies, the fake survey, the forged documents, the willful construction on private property. Every sentence was another nail in the coffin of his narrative. My attorney presented our evidence, photographs, property lines, invoices, everything meticulously organized. Then came the moment that sealed it. A representative from the State Surveyor Licensing Board took the stand. Calm, factual, precise. He explained that Precision Property Solutions was not, and had never been, licensed to perform surveying work in the state. No records, no employees, no permits. It was a shell company, fabricated to give the illusion of legitimacy. Watching the jury absorb that truth was powerful. You could feel the shift in the room, the collective realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate deceit. When my turn came to testify, I told the truth as plainly as I could. About the day I came home to find my land violated. About the anger, the confusion, the humiliation of being told by someone else that my property wasn't really mine. My voice stayed steady, but when I looked at the jurors, I saw understanding in their faces. Not sympathy, understanding. Because everyone, on some level, knows what it feels like to be disrespected, to have your boundaries crossed, to fight for something that should have never been taken in the first place. By the end of the trial, the verdict felt inevitable. Guilty on all counts. The judge's tone was firm but controlled as he laid out the sentence. 18 months in county jail for Stephen, with a possibility of early release under work conditions. His brother-in-law received 12 months. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the gavel. No one cheered. Justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it just settles in quietly, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. Walking out of that courthouse, the air felt lighter. Not because I'd won, but because the truth had finally taken its rightful place. The world doesn't often hand you that kind of closure. Usually, we have to make peace with unfair endings. But this time, the balance was restored. Even the HOA, once loud and self-righteous, sent an official letter acknowledging their mistake and confirming in writing that my property was never under their authority. The irony wasn't lost on me. The organization that tried to control everything couldn't even control the fallout of one-man-ass arrogance. In the weeks that followed, Stephen's house went up for sale. He needed the money to cover the damages, the court costs, the restitution. Watching the "for sale" sign go up on his lawn was like watching the final chapter close. I didn't feel joy in it, just completion. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it's simply the world correcting itself, inch by inch, decision by decision. Neighbors who once stayed silent now waved when they saw me. Some apologized for believing the HOA's story. Others just nodded, the kind of nod that says, "You did what we couldn't." And maybe that's the most satisfying part of all this, the quiet empowerment that comes from standing your ground, not with rage, but with resolve. Looking back now, it's clear that the real fight wasn't about a driveway. It was about dignity, about proving that truth still matters, even in a world that often rewards the loudest liar. And in that sense, the outcome wasn't just mine. It was a reminder to everyone watching that decency, though quiet, still wins in the end. When the dust finally settled, both literally and metaphorically, it was strange how quiet everything became. The lawsuit had ended, The court orders were finalized, and Stephen's name had been reduced from a neighborhood headline to a whispered cautionary tale. Justice had run its course, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could walk my property without that tightness in my chest. No lawyers, no letters, no watching over my shoulder for the next act of arrogance disguised as community improvement. Just peace, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. The settlement came through a few weeks later, a number so large it almost felt surreal. Over $200,000, triple damages for trespass, the cost of removing the illegal driveway, and compensation for the trees that had once stood proud before his bulldozers arrived. I wasn't celebrating the money, though. What mattered wasn't the check. It was the acknowledgement. Every signature on that agreement, every dollar transferred, was a tangible reminder that truth had weight. And sometimes it crushes arrogance completely. The restoration work began soon after. Watching the demolition crew tear up that driveway was oddly therapeutic. The same sound of heavy machinery that once filled me with dread now felt like renewal. They hauled away the debris, replaced the soil, and replanted the 6 trees Stephen had destroyed. Each one cost over $15,000 to replace, and for once, that number made me smile. Poetic, really. He'd tried to erase part of my land, and now, by law, he was funding its rebirth. The landscaper asked if I wanted to plant the same species, or try something new. I told him, let's make it better than before. That became my quiet mantra for everything that followed. When the HOA's apology letter arrived, I didn't frame it, but I probably should have. It was short, formal, dripping with that bureaucratic tone only organizations like that can produce. But the words still mattered. They admitted their mistake. They clarified, in writing, that my property had never been, and would never be, under their jurisdiction. Copies went out to every homeowner in the community. I can't lie. Seeing my neighbors' faces afterward, a mix of sympathy and awkward guilt, was satisfying in its own subtle way. I hadn't just defended my own rights. I'd set a boundary that would protect others, too. As for Stephen, his downfall unfolded quietly. His house sold quickly, below market value, of course, because who wants to buy a home with a legal scandal attached? I heard he moved out of state, his marriage dissolved, and his brother-in-law's fake company was shut down permanently. There's no joy in someone else's ruin, but there is a deep, undeniable satisfaction in knowing consequences finally caught up with him. He built his entire identity on authority and appearance, and in the end, both crumbled faster than the driveway he tried to claim. Life, after all of it, felt different. Simpler, but sharper, somehow. I used part of the settlement to build a full privacy fence along the border where his property used to meet mine. Not out of spite, but out of closure. A tangible reminder that peace sometimes needs to be built, not just wished for. I even upgraded my own driveway, paved it properly this time, added a small stone path lined with lights. Not because I needed it, but because I could. Every improvement was an act of quiet defiance, proof that you can be wronged, fight back with grace, and still come out better for it. Funny thing, though, those concrete barriers I'd installed before the court ruling, I never removed them. They're still there, moss creeping over the sides, standing like sentinels of memory. New neighbors ask about them sometimes, curious about the story. I tell them everything, how it started, what it cost, what it taught me. And every time I tell it, I realize the same truth. Standing up for yourself isn't just about winning. It's about teaching the world how to treat you. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to walk over your boundaries, literally or otherwise, you know how heavy it feels. The pressure to let it go, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. But peace isn't built on surrender. It's built on strength, the quiet, steady kind that refuses to bow to intimidation. That's what this whole ordeal taught me. You can be kind, but still firm. You can be patient, but still unyielding. And sometimes, doing the right thing means being willing to be uncomfortable for a while. Today, when I look at my property, it's more than just land. It's a reflection of resilience. Every fence post, every replanted tree, every stretch of reclaimed soil tells the same story. Boundaries aren't selfish, they're sacred. And maybe that's the biggest lesson in all of this. Don't let anyone convince you that defending what's yours makes you difficult. It makes you whole. So here's where I leave it to you. After everything, the fake survey, the lawsuits, the jail time, the settlement, some people still ask me if I went too far. Was it really worth it? Did I have to push so hard that Stephen lost his house, his job, and even his marriage? And honestly, I've asked myself that question too. Not because I regret defending what was mine, but because when you finally win, there's a strange quiet that follows. You expect victory to feel like fireworks, but sometimes it feels like standing in the aftermath, wondering if the cost of justice is peace itself. Still, every time I walk past the line where that illegal driveway used to be, I remember what started it all, a man's belief that authority excused arrogance, that paperwork could override decency. And I remind myself that if I hadn't stood up, he would have kept walking over that line, both literally and metaphorically. Maybe not just on my land, but on the next person's, and the one after that. Because that's how entitlement works. It spreads until someone draws a line and says, "No more." So maybe I didn't go too far. Maybe I went exactly as far as necessary. Justice isn't revenge, it's balance. And sometimes restoring balance means watching someone face consequences they never thought applied to them. Do I wish it hadn't gotten that ugly? Of course. But if I had taken the easy route, if I had settled early or ignored it altogether, I wouldn't be telling this story from a place of peace. I'd be telling it from resentment. But now, I want to hear from you. Was I wrong for pushing until the very end? Was I justified in letting the law take its course? Or was there a point where justice turned into pride? I genuinely want to know what you think, because stories like this don't just belong to the people living them. They belong to all of us who've ever been tested, who've ever had to decide when enough is enough. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're there, check out my playlist for more stories that'll make you question where the line between right and revenge really lies.